Now we have the privilege to hear 3 scriptural talks by members of the governing body. We'll first enjoy a talk by our dear brother David Splain entitled The Way of Holiness.
Incredible. That's the only way to describe it. The word had gone out that the Jews who had been captives in Babylon were free to leave and to return to their homeland, Israel. Now, you all know why that was incredible, because Babylon never released its captives. But Babylon had been overthrown, and the new administration had said that the Jews were free to go. Only Jehovah could have been responsible for that. So, every family head had a decision to make: to leave Babylon or to stay behind. Now you might say, there was no decision to make at all. That's not a hard decision. But wait, hold it. Most of the Jews had been born in Babylon, and most of their parents had been born in Babylon. It was the only home they knew. Their roots were there. And according to certain records, some of them had got prosperous. Some of them had got wealthy. There are records of Jews buying and selling precious gems and other luxury items. So, one says, I can't leave Babylon. My business partner is a Babylonian, and the business is doing really well, and there'd be no market for the products we sell in Israel. Another would say, my son married a Babylonian woman, and they just had a baby, our first grandchild. He's so cute, I can't leave now. So on the one hand, you have these material benefits from remaining in Babylon. But on the other hand, the ability of the Jews to worship Jehovah freely was severely limited. It's said that there were 50 pagan temples in the capital alone, but there was no temple of Jehovah there. And the Levites weren't able to follow the law of Moses properly. They could only do so to a limited degree. So you had material advantages to staying, but the spiritual blessings that awaited those who chose to leave were going to be immense. And for spiritually minded Jews, it was no contest, because they wanted to leave Babylon and reestablish pure worship in the promised land, in Israel. And so, if they were physically able to do so, they would leave Babylon and travel to Jerusalem, a city most of them had never seen, a city in ruins. But Jehovah promised to make the trip from Babylon to Jerusalem as easy as possible. And to confirm that and to get a little picture in our minds, we're going to read a series of 4 different scriptures. And each scripture is going to add a little detail to what Jehovah had in mind. So the first one is found in Isaiah chapter 40, verses 3 and 4. And I'll wait a moment because it'd be good if we could read this together. This is Isaiah chapter 40, the well-known words of verses 3 and 4. A voice of one calling in the wilderness, clear up the way of Jehovah. Make a straight highway through the desert. A straight highway through the desert for our God. Let every valley be raised up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The rough ground must become level, and the rugged ground a valley plain. You know, every time I read these words, I think of Brother Kerry Barber. He must have loved this passage, because very often in his prayers he would quote this passage word for word. Good memories of Brother Barber. But now, it talks about making a straight highway through the desert. If some of you have gone to the Ramapo project, you know what site work is all about. How would you like to have the construction committee in Ramapo take that job on? Make a straight highway through the desert. When you come to a mountain, you've got to level it. You come to a valley, you've got to bring it up. That would be quite a job. I think they have enough on their plate. They don't need to worry about this kind of site work. But this was going to be a big job, but in the end, it would be a lot easier to travel on a straight highway than to go up and down a mountain or down a valley, and it would be a lot faster too. So we know that there's going to be a straight highway between Babylon and Jerusalem. What else can we learn? Isaiah 57 and verse 14. Verse 14 says, "It will be said, build up a road, prepare the way," and here it comes, "remove any obstacle from the way of my people." So now we have two details. It's going to be a straight highway through the desert, and all of the obstacles are going to be cleared away. But now most highways have a name. Some of them are named after famous people. Others have a number. Does this special highway have a name? It does. And we go to Isaiah 35, 8 to 10 to find that name. I'm giving you a real workout this morning, but we have to do this to put it all together. Isaiah 35, verses 8 to 10. "And a highway will be there, yes, a way called," here it comes, "the way of holiness. The unclean one will not travel on it. It is reserved for the one walking on the way. No one foolish will stray onto it. No lion will be there, and no vicious wild beasts will come on it. They will not be found there. Only the repurchased ones will walk there." So what's the name? What's the special name of this highway? The Way of Holiness. Isn't that a nice name for a highway? Rattlesnakes, bears, foxes, and cougars are not allowed. I don't care how cute you think they are, they're not allowed on this special highway. Now, what else can we learn about this special highway? Today, you don't know who's traveling in the car next to yours. It could be somebody who has no business driving a car. The driver could be drunk. He could be on drugs. But on this highway, the unclean one is not permitted. Those who would break God's laws are not permitted to travel on that highways. Well, we're talking about the highway between Babylon and Jerusalem, and no doubt unclean ones among the Jews wouldn't be interested in going back to Israel anyway. They were probably very much at home with the idolatry of Babylon. Remember, their forefathers were no strangers to idolatry. So only those who were clean and acceptable in Jehovah's eyes were welcome to travel from Babylon back to Jerusalem. Now let's be clear. We don't know whether there was any literal road work done on the road between Babylon and Israel. It may be all figurative, but there could have been some road work done. Notice what Jehovah told the Jews to do in Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 21. And you'd say, why would Jehovah say all of these things if it was all to be ignored literally? Jeremiah 31 and verse 21. He says, "Set up road markers for yourself and put up signposts. Pay attention to the highway, the way that you have to go. Return, O Virgin of Israel. Return to these cities of yours." So no doubt, the first groups to use the road would remove obstacles and level things out the best they could so that those who followed would have an easier journey. So now what have we learned? What have we gleaned from this series of scriptures? First, there's a highway through the desert. We've also learned that it's to be cleared of obstacles. It has a special name, the way of holiness. And there were to be signposts so that those who traveled the road wouldn't get lost and maybe stray onto some other road. Now, what was the goal? Why did Jehovah want this road to be prepared so nicely? To make it as easy as possible for the Jews to leave Babylon and go back to Israel and reestablish pure worship. Did it work? Tens of thousands of men, women, and children responded to the call, the invitation, and with Jehovah's help, they arrived safely at their destination. Well, you might be thinking, this is all very nice, but what does it have to do with me? What does it have to do with us today? Plenty. Because today, not tens of thousands, but millions of men, women, and children are responding to the command, the urgent command, get out of her, get out of Babylon the Great. And the situation is different from the situation of the Jews in ancient times because they had a choice. They could remain in Babylon and still serve Jehovah, but people today have no choice. They must leave Babylon the Great. Their life depends on it. Now, without looking for a type and antitype and trying to fit everything in very neatly in this arrangement, we can say that there are some similarities between what happened to the Jews in ancient times and what is happening today. Because in a sense, when you start to study the Bible with someone, you are pointing him in the direction of the way of holiness. Now, some start studying and they start traveling on the road and then they turn back. But others keep going and they become dedicated, baptized disciples of Christ. Some travel in the fast lane. They make rapid progress. Others sort of take the far right lane and they poke along, but they keep making progress. And as long as they keep making progress, we'll study with them. Some break down, and that calls for roadside assistance. But it's easier to travel on the way of holiness today than it ever has been. And friends, this is partly due to the spiritual sight work that was started centuries ago. I'm going to repeat that. It is easier to travel the highway of holiness today because of the spiritual sight work that was started hundreds of years ago, long before Babylon the Great fell, long before the road was open for travelers. Now picture this. It's the 16th century. With shovel in hand, you are about to start sight work on the way of holiness. There's a mountain ahead of you, a mountain of ignorance. And you realize that if you're going to start to level that mountain, the first thing you're going to have to do is get the Bible into the hands of the people. For years, the Bible was only in Latin, and mostly educated people could read it, and even some of the clergy only knew enough Latin to conduct church services, but otherwise they couldn't understand it. Well, if you've been to our beautiful museum, some of you have taken a tour recently, you know that translators in many countries risk their freedom and even their lives to put the Bible into the language of the common people. And then printers produced those translations. And some of them used an assumed name because if they got caught printing a Bible, they could be arrested and even worse. So the mountain had to be leveled a shovelful at a time, one Bible at a time to reduce that mountain on the way of holiness. To get the Bible into the hands of the people, William Tyndale arranged to have thousands of copies of his translation smuggled into England in bales of cotton and other goods. This was dangerous. Tyndale's translation was banned in England, and if you merely possessed a copy of the Bible, that could bring you a stint in the Tower of London, or worse. But despite desperate attempts to stop work on the way of holiness, More copies of Tyndale's Bible were printed than the clergy could ever destroy. By the way, you'll be interested in a comment that Tyndale made in his comments on the book of Genesis, 1530 translation of the book of Genesis. He wrote, "Jehovah is God's name. Neither is any creature so called. As oft as thou seest Lord in capital letters, it is in Hebrew Jehovah." Early on, the name Jehovah was given some recognition. Well, with the Bible becoming more available and to the people, you'd expect that students of the Bible would want to share their research with others, and that was the case. In the years leading up to 1919, when Babylon the Great fell, more road work was done. And so we have men who share the fruitage of their research in tracts, in books, publications of all kinds, because they want the people to know. They want to reduce that mountain of ignorance. For example, about 1835, a Bible student by the name of Henry Grew wrote a pamphlet on the immortality of the soul. And in that pamphlet, Grew explained from the Bible that immortality is a reward for faithfulness. We're not born with it. Now, he published the tract anonymously because he knew there'd be trouble. And later on, there was trouble for Henry Grew. Well, he publishes a tract. But 2 years later, another Bible student, George Storrs, is riding in a train. And he looks down and he sees a tract there. And it's Henry Grew's tract on the immortality of the soul. He reads it and he becomes convinced that man doesn't have an immortal soul. So what does he do? He picks up a shovel and he starts working on the road, the way of holiness. In 1842, he gave a series of lectures on the intriguing theme, "Are the Wicked Immortal?" And he later published those lectures. Do you know how many copies were produced? 200,000 copies of that series of lectures. So that was decent road work on that way of holiness. Well, Storrs knew that he didn't have the whole truth on every subject. And in 1847, he made quite an interesting statement. It'd be interesting for us. He says, "We do well to remember that we have just emerged from the dark ages of the church." And notice this, "It would not be strange if we should find some Babylonish garments still worn by us." Well, he was right. Babylon still had influence in those days. Well, we know that George Storrs had an influence on Charles Taze Russell. And what do we know about Brother Russell and his associates? They weren't the first to discover that the Trinity and the immortality of the soul are false doctrines, or even that Christ's presence would be invisible to the human eye. They benefited from the careful preparatory work that other road workers had done in the past. So, translators, printers, and Bible students were doing spiritual sight work. And we might say that Brother Russell and his associates put the final touches on that way of holiness. Well, Babylon the Great fell in 1919, and then the way of holiness was opened for travelers. But Brother Russell died in 1916. Did he miss it? Did he miss the inauguration of the road? I don't think so. He didn't have a bird's eye view of the opening of the road. He had a heaven's eye view. Because Brother Russell and his associates who had finished their earthly course, they were able to look down from the heavens. And can you imagine how excited they were when they saw the first travelers set foot on the way of holiness? It must have been very exciting for them indeed. And it wouldn't be surprising if Brother Russell and his associates were firmly involved in the maintenance program of that way of holiness today. Because every good road needs ongoing maintenance. The way of holiness is open, but maintenance on that way of holiness goes on. And what's the goal? It's to make it as easy as possible for people to identify Babylon the Great and to leave Babylon the Great. That is the goal. Well, take the Bible, for example. There were Bible translations in 1919, but some of them were in archaic language that was hard to understand, and most of them didn't give the divine name the place of honor that it deserved. But now we have the New World Translation. What a blessing that has proved to be. It's so clear, and you don't have to mortgage the house to buy a copy, which was probably the case in the 16th century. And since 1919, there's been an abundance of spiritual food to make it easier for people to come into the truth. Now just think of this. In 1919, Babylon the Great fell. But what else happened in 1919? What provision did Jehovah make for these people? The faithful and discreet slave was appointed in that same year. And the slave didn't waste any time to start producing literature that was going to make it easier for people to come into the truth. 1919, the slave was appointed. By 1921, you have a brand new publication, The Harp of God. And it was especially designed for beginners and to make it easy for people to study and read and come into the truth. And that was necessary because in 1921, there was a shortage of teachers, of publishers who could conduct Bible studies with people. So you really needed something simple. And comparatively speaking, that Harp of God was simple. Now, there were very few publishers in those days, just a few thousand. But they were workers. They did a tremendous job. Do you realize that before the Harp of God went out of print, almost 6 million copies in 22 languages had been circulated? So this is evidence that maintenance work on the way of holiness had begun right after the road opened. Well, I doubt that very many in this audience have come into the truth through the Harp of God. Anybody here? I don't think so. What publication brought you into the truth? What publication helped you to identify the way of holiness? Was it The Truth Shall Make You Free? Let God Be True? The truth that leads to eternal life? You can live forever? The Knowledge Book? Enjoy Life Forever? Teach Us? What does the Bible teach us? Or is it our fine new publication, Enjoy Life Forever? All of these publications have been used to help people to break free from Babylon the Great. And this is proof positive that maintenance on the way of holiness is ongoing. This road work continues, and it gets better and better. Are you studying the Bible with someone with the help of Enjoy Life Forever? If you are, you're pointing that person to the way of holiness. So don't be afraid to offer studies, as Brother Sanderson mentioned. Business associates, relatives, schoolmates, anybody you can think of, offer Bible studies, and you'll be surprised at who will take you up on it. And as you do, keep in mind that while the road has been made easier for travelers, setting foot on that road takes courage and effort. So let's be ready to help those who are willing to respond. Millions have already taken that road, and it's our hope that millions more will do so before the end of this system of things. And we wish them all safe travels.